My name is Margot Hayes and I'm 66 years old. What I'm about to tell you changed my life forever. The funeral for my husband Ernest was the quietest day of my existence. That morning the grey sky hung so low it seemed to press against my shoulders as if even the heavens were suffocating under grief. I stood beside his grave trembling inside a black dress that still smelled faintly of mothballs and felt like my own breath had been buried with him. 42 years of marriage reduced to one narrow box of polished wood. 42 years of laughter, struggle, devotion lowered into cold earth. But it wasn't the pastor's words or the dirt falling like hollow drums on the casket that shattered me most. It was the vibration of my phone hidden in the clutch I held with white-knuckled hands. A message from an unknown number appearing on the screen like a cruel joke. I'm alive. For a moment I forgot to breathe. The letters blurred as if my tears had seeped into the screen itself. I typed with fingers stiff as ice, "That's not me in the casket." "Who are you?" The reply came swiftly, almost too swiftly. "I can't say. They are watching. Don't trust our sons." My vision tilted, the world went slanted. My own sons Charles and Henry stood not 10 feet away, composed, calm, their suits pressed, their faces touched with just enough grief to satisfy the watching eyes. But it was grief that looked rehearsed, tears that never truly fell. My heart rattled like a loose window in a storm. Could this be real? Could my Ernest still be alive? For 42 years he had been my anchor, my reason. We were born in the same small town of Spring Creek, raised on its dusty back roads, molded by its quiet poverty. I was 24 when he first spoke to me, his hands black with grease from repairing bicycles in the small shop his father had left him. I can still hear his shy, gentle voice in my head. "Good morning, Margot. Need me to check out your bike?" I didn't own a bike. I invented an excuse just to stand there longer, to watch the way his smile unfolded slowly like sunlight across a field. That single conversation grew into hours beneath the old oak in Town Square Park, promises whispered with more faith than fortune, and eventually into a wedding so simple we borrowed chairs from neighbors. We had no wealth, but our hands were always clasped tight, our laughter loud enough to fill the cracks in our leaking roof. When Charles was born I thought my heart might burst. Ernest had scooped him up like the world's greatest treasure, whispering stories of rivers and stars before the boy could even form words. 2 years later Henry arrived and my heart stretched once more. I fed them, clothed them, kissed away their nightmares, while Ernest taught them to fish, to men to value honesty above all else. 4 years we were whole. 4 years we were happy. But children grow, and sometimes they grow away. Charles, the eldest, was always restless, always hungry for more than our modest house with its tin roof could offer. At 14 he asked why we didn't own a car like the other families. At 16 he rolled his eyes at Ernest's calloused palms. At 18 he rejected his father's offer to work in the shop with words sharp enough to slice Ernest's heart in two. "I don't want to get my hands dirty. I'm going to be someone important." Henry, sweet Henry, once his father's shadow, followed Charles's lead like a loyal echo. Where Charles went Henry trailed. Where Charles scoffed Henry laughed. Ernest hid his hurt behind evenings of stargazing on the porch, but I knew. I saw the heaviness in his jaw, the quiet sighs that replaced once booming chuckles. Still, when Charles found work in real estate, when Henry followed into the world of suits and ties, I beamed with pride. My boys had escaped poverty. They had carved lives I never dreamed of for them. But that pride soured slowly. Their visits dwindled, their calls shortened. When they did appear they brought not warmth but pity. Their words became daggers hidden in politeness. "This house is falling apart, Mom. Don't you want better, Dad? You're too old for that shop. Retire before you hurt yourself." I wanted to believe it was love disguised as criticism. Ernest knew better. He told me one night, his coffee cooling between his tired hands, "Margot, money has changed our boys. We aren't enough anymore." I resisted, desperate to cling to hope. But deep inside I knew. I had lost them long before I lost Ernest. The distance widened when Charles married Jasmine. She was beautiful, flawless in red silk and high heels that sank into the dirt of our porch. Her handshake was a flick of fingers, her eyes roaming our home like it was something foul she had stepped in. She ate nothing of the meal I had poured my love into. I watched Charles apologize for his roots, whispering promises of restaurants next time. My son, my boy who once licked the bowl of my meatloaf, apologized for me. Henry remained single but no less distant, his phone glued to his hand even when he sat at our table. Always rushing, always leaving early, always elsewhere. Christmases turned brittle, Sundays turned silent. They gave us expensive gifts we neither wanted nor needed, then left within hours. Ernest and I filled the emptiness with each other, but it was a cruel trade, two parents aging together while their children dissolved into strangers. The pressure began quietly. Jasmine suggesting retirement communities. Charles bringing papers for selling the house. Henry backing him with smooth false concern. Every conversation reeked of urgency and patience. Ernest resisted with dignity, but I saw the cracks forming in his faith. He worried aloud one night, whispering in the dark, "Something's wrong, Margot. This isn't just ambition. There's something darker here." I wish I had listened more closely. 3 weeks before the accident, Charles visited me alone. His voice was calm but his words twisted like a knife. "No matter what happens, Mom, Henry and I will always take care of you." I took it as reassurance then. Now beside Ernest's grave with the phone still burning in my palm, I heard the echo as a warning. The message said Ernest was alive. My sons stood nearby, their expressions carved in calmness. My husband's casket lay in the ground. My world had shattered, and yet it was only beginning to crack open to horrors I had not yet imagined. I went home from the cemetery wrapped in a silence so dense it felt like fog settling in my lungs. Doris tried to stay, tried to make soup I wouldn't touch, tried to make me lie down, but I needed movement, purpose, air. After she left, I walked my small house like a lost pilgrim that night, touching the things Ernest had touched: his mug with the crack near the handle, the dent in the porch step he never fixed because he said every home needs a quirk, the oil-smudged rag he tucked into his back pocket without thinking. I set his mug in the sink and it clinked like a bell tolling for a life I didn't know how to stop mourning. Then my phone lit up again on the countertop, a cold little lighthouse in a storm that had no shore. "Check the bank account," the unknown number wrote. "See who's been moving money." I should have dismissed it. I should have told myself it was a cruel prank, that people do vicious things to newly made widows. But the words landed the way truth does, heavy, ugly, undeniable. I found the file box where we kept our important papers, the deed, the shop's permit, the brittle manila envelope of medical bills we had defeated one by one through work and restraint. I flipped to the bank section. The last paper statement we'd requested, a habit Ernest kept even after everything moved online. 3 months old. Balances circled in his tight block letters. He'd written a small smiley face next to the number like it pleased him to see what we'd built didn't crumble overnight. Morning came grey and stunned. I dressed like a woman headed to do something ordinary, cardigan, flats, hair combed back, but inside I felt like I was walking into a battlefield with nothing but a paper shield. The bank smelled like lemon cleaner and carpet. Mrs. Thompson, who taught me to save a little from my housekeeping days, stepped out from behind her desk and gathered my hands. "Oh, Margot," she whispered, eyes bright with kindness. "I'm so sorry. I need copies of our statements for the last 6 months," I said, a little too crisp for a grieving widow. "All transactions. All withdrawals." We sat at her desk while she typed, her nails clacking like rain against a tin roof. When she slid the stack of papers across to me, the lines of numbers gathered into a shape that made my stomach roll. For withdrawals, large ones, amounts Ernest and I would have discussed over cups of coffee and midnight arithmetic. "Who authorized these?" I asked, keeping my voice steady by force. She pointed at the signature lines. Ernest's name, a little shakier than usual, sprawled across each one. "He came in himself," she said softly. "Twice with, I think it was Charles. He said he was having a hard time reading the fine print without his glasses." She added the last sentence with a small apologetic smile, like she was defending a man we both respected. Ernest, who wore his glasses on a string like a schoolteacher who never misplaced them except on purpose when he wanted an excuse to kiss me by the sink while I searched. Ernest, who didn't withdraw money without asking me whether the roof wanted patching or the tires wanted replacing or the tomatoes needed cages again. I thanked Mrs. Thompson with a calmness that didn't belong to me and walked back out into the late morning that had the nerve to be ordinary. At home, I laid the statements next to the insurance policy I'd pulled from our file. The coverage had been increased 6 months earlier. A sticky note in Ernest's careful script said for Margot just in case. But now that little square of tenderness looked like a leaf trapped under glass, too perfect, too still, something pinned by a hand I no longer recognized. My phone buzzed again. Go to the shop. Bottom drawer of his desk. There are things you didn't see. The shop door fought me, swollen with humidity and disuse. Inside, dust glittered in angled light and the smell of rubber and oil curled around the walls as if Ernest had just stepped into the back room to wash his hands. Only there were no scorch marks, no bent metal teeth, no gouged floor. The word explosion dissolved in my mouth like a lie I couldn't swallow. Every machine stood where it had always stood, patient and intact. I ran my fingers along the workbench. No blistering. No ash. A spider had even built a fragile palace in the corner undisturbed. I opened the desk. Receipts, spare keys, an old Polaroid of Ernest holding baby Henry and beaming so wide you could see the crooked tooth he refused to fix because he said it made him look like a boy. In the bottom drawer under a ledger I found the first note. Charles insists I need more insurance. Says it's to protect you. Feels wrong. I can't put my finger on it. Dated 3 days before the accident. Under it another. Henry brought papers to sign for modernization. My hands shook reading. Why the rush, why the rush? I sat back, the stool creaking in complaint. The notes trembled in my grip, thin skin on bone. I hadn't been blind exactly, I'd been loyal. I had shielded my sons from my suspicions with the same arms that once shielded them from thunderstorms. I had called my fear love and my silence faith. At the very back of the drawer lay a sealed envelope thick with breath. Margot in his steady hand. The paper sliced my thumb when I opened it. Maybe that's why the first line burned. If you're reading this, my love, it means something happened to me. He wrote about feeling watched, about Charles's questions that had too many teeth, about Henry appearing with forms that multiplied like weeds. I heard the way Charles says accident like a man who's already written the headline. If anything happens, do not trust quickly, not even our boys. I love you beyond the border of breath. Ernest. I pressed the letter to my chest until the edges dug in. Grief roared through me, then steadied into a thin wire of purpose. I took pictures of the notes with my trembling phone. As if summoned by his own name, it buzzed. Tomorrow 3 p.m., corner calf. Back table. Ask for Stephen. He has what Ernest paid him to keep safe. I typed back, who are you? A pause. Then a friend Ernest hired when he realized love wouldn't be enough to keep you safe. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the kitchen table with Ernest's letter, my tea cooling to a skin, the house exhaling around me. At 1 a.m., my phone flashed again, this time with my son's name. Mom, how are you holding up? Charles wrote. Henry and I were talking, maybe we should come over tomorrow and help sort through Dad's papers. A lot of that stuff is complicated. We don't want you to get overwhelmed. I stared at the glowing screen, at the lying tenderness threaded through his punctuation. I typed, I'm fine. I don't need anything right now. Then deleted it. Then typed, tomorrow is busy. Another day. Then didn't send that either. I turned the phone face down and listened to the clock chew the hours. Morning came with that bank cleaner smell again, lemon and false brightness. I put on the purple dress Ernest said made my eyes look like berries. I braided my hair because my hands needed the ritual. The corner calf had been around since before I learned the price of fabric by the inch. The bell over the door rang like the start of something I wasn't ready to name. At 2:58 a man in his 50s walked in with a file folder tucked under his arm. He had the kind of posture people get when they've learned to carry heavy truths without dropping them. Grey at the temples, eyes steady, clothes too plain to remember. When his gaze found me, he gave the smallest nod and crossed the room like someone careful of every witness. "Mrs. Hayes," he said softly, stopping by my table. I felt an old instinct to stand and offer coffee pie comfort. Instead, I nodded and wrapped my fingers around my teacup to keep them from shaking. "I'm Stephen," he said. "Stephen Callahan. Ernest hired me 3 weeks before. He placed the folder between us like a shared altar. I'm sorry for your loss. And for what I'm about to show you." The room should have gone quiet, but it didn't. Cups clinked. Milk frothed. A child laughed at something sticky. Life had the audacity to keep moving while mine was about to change shape again. Stephen opened the folder. Inside, like dark birds, lay photographs, receipts, transcripts, and something small and metallic, a recorder. He slid it toward me. "Your husband wanted you to have answers," he said. "But answers have sharp edges." He paused as if to offer me one last chance to walk back into the painless lie. "Are you ready?" I thought of Ernest's hand in the hospital, how I'd felt it try to speak against mine. I thought of the empty space by the oak tree where we kissed when we were young, and of the text that said, "Don't trust our sons." I straightened my back and nodded. "Press play," Stephen said. The button clicked. And then, like a voice crossing a river to reach me, Ernest filled the tiny space between us. Ernest's voice was weaker than I remembered, like the weight of suspicion had already begun to drain the strength from his words. Yet it was unmistakably him, steady, deliberate, a man who never wasted breath on nonsense. "Stephen," he said on the recording, "if something happens to me, it won't be an accident. Charles has been pushing me to increase the insurance again. Says it's for Margot. But I've seen the way his eyes light up when we talk numbers. It doesn't feel like care. It feels like calculation. Henry follows him like always. He asked me last week what I usually eat for breakfast, how many sugars I take in my coffee, whether Margot ever sits with me in the mornings." It was a strange conversation. I couldn't shake the feeling he was memorizing a routine for someone else's use. "If I don't make it, you'll know why." My hand clamped against my chest. The recorder sat on the table between me and Stephen, but it may as well have been pressing straight into my heart. To hear Ernest's voice again was like being handed back a piece of my soul, only for that piece to be scorched, scarred, ruined. Stephen let the silence stretch a moment, his eyes studying me carefully. "That was 3 weeks before his death," he said gently. "There's more." He pressed play again. This time the voice was not Ernest's. It was Charles's, sharp, businesslike, speaking into a phone. "No, we can't wait any longer. The old man is starting to suspect." I told him the methanol was a vitamin supplement the doctor recommended. "He'll drink it with his coffee like always. By the time the symptoms set in, everyone will think it's a stroke. Mom will be devastated, she won't question anything. By the time she recovers, we'll have the money." My fingers went cold, numb against the teacup. The calf around me faded to a blur. Mother's chattered, spoons clinked, someone laughed at the counter. But all I could hear was my son's voice plotting my husband's death like it was a business deal, like it was a chess move. My baby, the boy who once sobbed because he'd broken a bird's egg in his palm, spoke of poisoning his father without a shred of hesitation. Stephen's voice broke through the ringing in my ears. "There's another clip. Henry this time." He pressed play once more. "Everything's ready," Henry said, his tone edged with nervous excitement. "Tomorrow Charles will put it in Dad's coffee. Symptoms should start fast: confusion, blindness, then collapse. The hospital will call it heart failure or brain trauma. Mom will never know." I shoved the recorder back across the table as if it had burned me. My stomach churned so violently I thought I might be sick right there. I wanted to deny it, to scream that it was a trick, that someone had spliced my son's voices into a cruel fiction. But the cadence, the phrasing the little Cy Henry always gave between sentences, they were real. Sickeningly real. Stephen spoke low, careful. We have photographs too. Charles buying methanol at a hardware store 5 days before Ernest's collapse. Paid in cash, but the security footage shows his face clear as day. And Henry, his gambling debts are stacked a mile high. $40,000 he couldn't pay back. They were desperate. I closed my eyes, shaking my head like the gesture could undo reality. They killed him, I whispered. My boys, they killed their father. They planned to kill you too. I opened my eyes, shocked. What? Stephen slid out another paper, a transcript. They said once Ernest's insurance came through, they couldn't risk you getting suspicious. The plan was to stage your death as a suicide from grief. A widow who couldn't live without her husband. It would have looked plausible. The room spun. For a moment I thought I might black out, collapse like Ernest had. My sons had not only taken their father from me, but they had already drawn blueprints for my death too, as though I were just another obstacle in their greedy path. Stephen reached across the table, steadying my trembling hand with his own. I know this is unbearable, Mrs. Hayes. But Ernest hired me for exactly this reason. He suspected, he feared, and he wanted the truth protected if he couldn't protect you himself. I swallowed hard, my throat raw. So what do we do now? He leaned closer, lowering his voice. We take it to the police. Tonight. We can't wait. Your sons are meeting with a judge tomorrow morning, trying to have you declared mentally incompetent. If they succeed, you won't be able to defend yourself. They'll control your money, your decisions, everything. Tears burned my eyes, but not the soft tears of grief. These were sharp, hot, acidic tears of rage, of betrayal, of clarity. I wiped them away with the back of my hand and forced my voice steady. Then we stop them. Tonight. Stephen gave the smallest nod, his jaw tightening with resolve. We'll go to Sergeant O'Connell. He's honest. He won't look the other way. I gathered Ernest's notes, the photographs, the transcripts, and the recorder back into the folder. My heart hammered so loudly it was all I could hear. For weeks I had been drifting, broken, grieving, doubting my own sanity. Now every nerve in my body burned with a singular purpose. Justice. When I stepped out of the cafe into the late afternoon sun, I thought of the message that had started it all. I'm alive. Perhaps Ernest wasn't alive in body, but in that moment I felt him alive in me, guiding my steps, strengthening my spine. He had trusted me to finish what he began, to turn love into armor, to turn truth into a weapon sharper than greed. That night Stephen and I walked into the police station with the folder clutched in my hands like scripture. Sergeant O'Connell looked up from his desk, surprise etched across his lined face. Mrs. Hayes, he said gently. What brings you here? I set the folder down in front of him with a finality that echoed like thunder. I'm here to report the murder of my husband, I said. My voice didn't shake. By our sons. Sergeant O'Connell froze, his pen suspended above a half-finished report. His eyes darted between me and the folder as if he were waiting for me to laugh, to take it back, to confess that grief had made me delusional. But I didn't waver. I pushed the folder closer, the edges frayed from Ernest's drawer, now heavy with everything that mattered. Open it, I whispered. He did. Slowly. Like a man dismantling a bomb. One by one he lifted the pieces of our nightmare into the fluorescent light. Ernest's handwritten notes, photographs of Charles at the hardware store, bank statements, the recorder with its damning voices. His expression hardened line by line, jaw tightening, brows knitting deeper, until finally he sat back and exhaled through his nose. This, he muttered, shaking his head. This is monstrous. Stephen leaned forward. Sergeant, we don't have time. The sons are planning to have Mrs. Hayes declared mentally incompetent tomorrow morning. Judge Miller 10 a.m. If they succeed, she'll lose all her rights. They'll have full control of her estate. O'Connell looked at me, his eyes softening. Mrs. Hayes, do you understand what you're asking me to do? If we proceed, if we arrest your sons, there's no turning back. This will destroy what's left of your family. My family died, I said, my voice low but fierce, the moment my sons poisoned their father. They aren't my family anymore. They are murderers. And if you don't stop them, they'll finish what they started with me. The sergeant held my gaze for a long-waited beat. Then he reached for the phone on his desk. I'll call the district attorney. Tonight. What followed was a blur of hours, but each moment etched itself into my memory like a scar. The district attorney arrived in person, summoned by the gravity of the evidence. We sat in a small windowless room while Stephen laid everything out again: the recordings, the transcripts, the photographs, the forged death certificate. The DA's face darkened as the puzzle completed itself piece by treacherous piece. By midnight the decision was made. Warrants would be issued for Charles and Henry's arrest at dawn. Ernest's body would be exhumed for toxicology to confirm the methanol poisoning. The doctor who falsified the report would face charges too. When O'Connell escorted me out into the cool night air, my legs trembled under me. But it wasn't fear anymore. It was release. For the first time since Ernest collapsed in that hospital bed, I felt something like strength uncoiling inside me. Stephen walked me home. He offered to stay, but I shook my head. I need to be alone with Ernest tonight, I said. Alone, I sat at our kitchen table until the hours bled into dawn, staring at the photographs on the wall. Ernest with the boys on fishing trips, Ernest holding me on our wedding day, Ernest asleep on the couch with a book sliding from his chest. Memories that now felt like artifacts from a world that had burned down. At 6 a.m., my phone rang. Charles. Mom, his voice rushed, urgent. Something's happened. You need to come to Henry's house right now. My grip on the phone tightened. What happened? I asked, feigning concern. It's better if I explain in person. Please just come quickly. It was a trap. I knew it in my marrow. The recordings had revealed their plans, their desperation, their intention to silence me. If I stepped into that house, I might never step out again. I'll be there soon, I lied. After I hung up, I stood by the window watching the quiet street, waiting. At 7:30, police cruisers rolled past one by one, their lights muted, heading toward both Charles's and Henry's houses. My phone rang again and again. Charles, then Henry, their voices rising from urgent to frantic, but I didn't answer. At 9 a.m., there was a knock on my door. O'Connell stood there, solemn but resolute. Mrs. Hayes, he said, we have your sons in custody. They've been charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. My knees nearly gave way, but this time it was relief, not despair, that made them weak. How did they react? Charles denied everything until we played him the recordings. Then he broke down. Henry tried to run. We chased him 6 blocks before he gave up. I sank into a chair, burying my face in my hands. The tears that came weren't the raw grief of losing Ernest. They were the fierce, scalding tears of vindication. Justice. Finally, justice. Later that afternoon, there was another knock. Jasmine stood on my porch, mascara streaking her face, sobbing as though she were the one betrayed. Please, she begged, clutching at my hands. Please drop the charges against Charles. He's not a bad man, he was just desperate. It's my fault, I pressured him, I made him feel cornered. I looked at her, at this woman who had sneered at my home, who had whispered disdain into my son's ear, who now wanted mercy after blood had already been spilled. Your husband poisoned mine, I said, my voice flat as stone. He planned to kill me too. There is no excuse for that. Not debt. Not pressure. Not you. But we are family, she wailed. I pulled my hands free. Family died the moment you decided Ernest's life was worth less than money. Get off my porch. She left her sobs echoing down the street. 3 days later, Ernest's body was exhumed. The toxicology confirmed what the recordings had already told us: lethal levels of methanol in his system. The final piece of doubt was erased. My husband had been murdered. The town erupted with shock when the news broke. Neighbors whispered, newspapers ran headlines, people I barely knew stopped me in the market to touch my arm and shake their heads in disbelief. 2 sons murdering their father for money, it was unthinkable. Unforgivable. And yet it was true. The trial was scheduled within months. The courtroom filled with neighbors, reporters, and strangers hungry for a story. But for me, it wasn't a story. It was my life ripped open, every private wound displayed for judgment. I walked into that courtroom with my head high, Ernest's letter in my purse, and the certainty that though grief had broken me, truth had rebuilt me stronger. Because I wasn't just fighting for Ernest anymore. I was fighting for the part of me that had been silenced, manipulated, nearly erased. I was fighting for every widow who'd ever been told she was too fragile, too emotional, too broken to see the truth. And I swore I would not let Ernest's death be in vain. The courthouse smelled faintly of old wood and dust, like every sorrow it had ever witnessed was still trapped between its beams. When I took my seat at the plaintiff's table beside the prosecutor, my hands shook so badly that I pressed them together just to feel them stop fighting me. Stephen sat in the row behind me, a quiet sentinel. His presence steadied me, reminded me that I wasn't alone, not anymore. Charles and Henry were brought in through the side door, shackled at the wrists. My heart nearly stopped when I saw them. They looked thinner, their expensive suits replaced by orange prison jumpsuits, their hair unkempt, their faces pale. But what made my stomach twist was how familiar they still were, the same eyes I'd kissed goodnight 1,000 times, the same shoulders I'd steadied when they'd taken their first steps. My boys. My murderers. Charles avoided my gaze, staring at the floor as though shame itself weighed his head down. Henry, however, glared at me with something between defiance and despair. For a moment my chest squeezed with the memory of his first fishing trip, how he had cried when he couldn't hook the worm, how Ernest had guided his little hands patiently. I wanted to cling to that memory, but it shattered against the cold truth: those hands had signed away their father's life. The prosecutor opened with precision. He presented the insurance increases, the bank withdrawals, the doctored death certificate, the photographs of Charles at the hardware store. Each piece landed like a stone thrown into a still pond, rippling through the room. The jury leaned forward, silent, stunned. Then came the recordings. Ernest's voice filled the courtroom, first steady, even in fear: if something happens to me, it won't be an accident. My sons are pushing me to change the insurance. I don't trust them anymore. I saw jurors cover their mouths, neighbors shake their heads in disbelief. Tears rolled down my cheeks as I listened to my husband predict his own death, to the careful suspicion he had carried alone so I wouldn't bear it with him. Then Charles's voice. Cold, transactional. The old man is getting suspicious. I already have the methanol. He'll drink it without knowing. Mom won't be a problem once he's gone. The gasps that filled the courtroom were louder than the recording itself. A woman in the gallery burst into tears. Someone whispered, "My God." Finally, Henry's voice edged with a sick eagerness, "Tomorrow Charles will put it in Dad's coffee. The doctors will think it's a stroke. By the time anyone suspects, it'll be too late." I closed my eyes, pressing my palms flat against my skirt. Hearing those words spoken in Henry's familiar cadence was like watching my own heart be crushed beneath a boot. The children I had raised were gone. In their place stood men who had calculated every sip of their father's last coffee, every convulsion, every breath. When it was my turn to testify, my legs shook as I walked to the stand, but my voice was clear. "I thought we were a close family," I said, looking at the jury, then at my sons. "I raised Charles and Henry with love. I gave them everything I had. Their father worked himself to the bone for them. We weren't rich, but we were happy. At least I thought we were. I never imagined the boys I nursed, the boys I prayed over at night, would someday kill the very man who gave them life." Charles kept his head bowed. Henry's jaw tightened, but I saw his eyes glisten. Too late for tears. Too late for regret. The defense tried to argue desperation. They spoke of debts, of Jasmine's pressure, of fear driving them to madness. But every time they spoke, the recordings thundered louder in my head: calm, deliberate, premeditated. This wasn't madness. It was murder. The trial lasted 3 days, though each hour stretched like a lifetime. On the final day, the prosecutor stood before the jury. "These are not men who acted in a moment of panic," he said firmly. "These are men who planned, plotted, and poisoned. They saw their father not as a man who had loved them, but as a ledger to be balanced, a policy to be cashed. And when their mother began asking questions, they plotted to silence her too. This is not desperation. This is cold-blooded betrayal." When the jury returned after 6 long hours, I felt my pulse pounding so hard I thought it might crack my ribs. The foreman stood. "In the case of the state versus Charles Hayes and Henry Hayes on the charge of first-degree murder of Ernest Hayes, we find the defendants guilty." The words shattered the air. Guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to commit the murder of Margot Hayes, we find the defendants guilty. I exhaled so sharply it hurt. The courtroom erupted in gasps, murmurs, sobs. Charles's shoulders collapsed inward, his face hidden in his hands. Henry sat frozen, staring ahead with the empty eyes of a man whose soul had already been condemned. The judge's voice cut through the noise. "Charles Hayes and Henry Hayes, for the murder of your father and conspiracy to murder your mother, I sentence you to life imprisonment without parole for 30 years. The gavel struck. Final. Irrevocable. I sat in that wooden chair, trembling, tears streaking my cheeks, but for the first time since Ernest's death I felt a weight lift. Justice, bitter, brutal justice, had been served. Afterward, people approached me, some hugging me, others whispering words of sympathy. Doris clutched my hand, sobbing. "Ernest can rest now," she whispered. I nodded, though my heart still felt split in two. Because while justice had been done, it hadn't brought Ernest back. And it hadn't erased the unbearable truth: my sons were murderers. That night I sat alone on the porch, looking at the stars Ernest once loved so much. I held his letter in my lap, tracing his handwriting with trembling fingers. "You were right," I whispered to the night. Something was wrong. And I was too blind to see it until it was almost too late. But I promise you, Ernest, I will carry this truth. I will make sure no one forgets what you suffered or what they did. They will never silence me." And for the first time in weeks I thought I felt it, the faintest warmth of his presence beside me, like a hand resting gently on mine. The weeks after the verdict felt strangely hollow, as if my life had been stripped down to its bones. People stopped me in town, at the market, at church, even in the post office, to tell me how brave I was, how strong, how justice had finally been done. But when I came home, when I stepped back into the quiet that used to be filled with Ernest's humming or the clatter of his tools, all I felt was emptiness. I had fought so hard for the truth, and I had won. But the victory didn't bring him back. It didn't erase the sound of Charles's voice on that recorder or the cold determination in Henry's words. It didn't change the fact that I had buried my husband and in the process lost both of my sons. 3 days after sentencing, I received a letter from prison. It was from Charles. The handwriting was messy, nothing like the careful script he once practiced as a boy. "Mom, I don't deserve forgiveness. I know that. But I need you to know I regret everything. The debts, the desperation, the greed, it consumed us. I thought I could fix it all with money, and instead I destroyed everything. I don't ask you to forgive me. I only ask you to remember that once, a long time ago, I was your little boy who loved you. Please don't forget that version of me. Charles." I read the letter until the paper went soft under my fingers. My tears smudged the ink, but they didn't blur the meaning. The sun I raised, the child I loved, still flickered somewhere inside the man who poisoned his father. But flickers don't undo flames. Regret doesn't resurrect the dead. A month later, news came from the prison. Charles had hanged himself in his cell. By the time guards found him, it was too late. When they told me, I felt something tear inside me, but it wasn't grief the way it had been with Ernest. It was relief tangled with sorrow, pity braided with anger. My son had chosen death over carrying the weight of his crime. And though I wished he had lived long enough to repent fully, I also knew his soul had been restless from the start. Henry, when he heard of his brother's death, suffered what the prison doctor called a psychotic break. He stopped eating, stopped sleeping, screamed in the night that Ernest was standing over his bed. They moved him to the prison psychiatric ward after he tried to slit his wrists with a shard of glass. To this day he remains there, a hollow shell of the boy who once begged his father to let him reel in the first fish. I don't visit. Some people call me cruel for that. They say blood is blood. But I've learned blood means nothing without loyalty, without love. My true family died with Ernest. What remains is just a shadow I refuse to keep feeding. Instead, I turned my pain into purpose. With the life insurance money tainted as it was, I started the Ernest Hayes Foundation for Victims of Family Crimes. I couldn't bear to spend that blood-stained money on myself, but I could use it to help others. The foundation offers legal support, counseling, and private investigators for families betrayed by those closest to them. If Ernest's death could save others from living my nightmare, then maybe his suffering would not be in vain. 6 months into running the foundation, a woman named Eleanor came to me. She was 40, trembling, clutching a folder like it was her last lifeline. She believed her brother had murdered their mother for inheritance. Her story echoed mine so closely it chilled me. Strange financial movements, sudden pressure to sell the family home, whispers of accidents that didn't add up. We provided her with a lawyer and a private investigator, and 3 months later her brother was convicted. She hugged me after the verdict, sobbing into my shoulder. "Mrs. Hayes, you saved me. If you hadn't had the courage to speak out against your sons, I never would have had the courage to speak out against my brother." Her words lit something inside me I hadn't felt since Ernest's death, a sense of meaning. My tragedy had become a torch, and with it I could light the way for others lost in the dark. Stephen, dear Stephen, the private investigator who had given me back the truth, never left my side. He visited weekly, sometimes under the guise of foundation business, sometimes simply to share coffee on the porch. He became my anchor in a way I hadn't expected, not replacing Ernest, no one ever could, but reminding me that trust could still exist in this world. One evening, as we watched the sun dip low over the garden I had planted where Ernest's shop once stood, Stephen asked me softly, "Do you ever regret it, turning them in?" I didn't need time to think. "Never," I said. The truth hurts, but lies kill the soul. They stopped being my sons when they chose betrayal over love. Justice was all that was left. Spring Creek never forgot the case. It became a legend, a cautionary tale whispered in classrooms and churches, a warning of how greed can rot even the strongest bonds. Some called me brave, others whispered that I was heartless for condemning my own flesh and blood. But I stopped caring what people said. I knew the truth, and the truth gave me peace. 5 years have passed. I'm 71 now, my hair silver, my hands softer with age. Every Sunday I walk to Ernest's grave with flowers from the garden, sunflowers, his favorite, their faces always searching for the sun. His headstone reads, "Beloved husband, betrayed father, honorable man." His love was stronger than his death. I sit by the grave and tell him everything, the families we've helped, the letters of thanks, the lives changed because he had the foresight to fight for truth even in his last days. And sometimes when the wind stirs through the trees, I feel his presence so strongly I almost expect him to sit beside me, grease-stained hands holding mine. My story is not one of triumph alone. It is a story of love and betrayal, of justice bought at the highest cost. I lost my husband to poison, my sons to greed, my family to betrayal. But I found something too, strength I didn't know I had, a purpose that stretches beyond my pain. And if there is one lesson I've carried through all of it, it is this: family is not blood. Family is love. Blood can betray you, but love never does. Did you like my story, and where are you watching from? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your reflections. If this story touched you, please like, share, and subscribe so I can continue bringing you more life stories that matter. Thank you for walking through this with me.